The banana, simple, healthy, and ever-present, seems innocent enough. But its cheerful image is a carefully crafted illusion, hiding a brutal history of exploitation. Behind every banana lies a story of corporate greed, political manipulation, and suffering across Central America. The companies that made bananas a household staple also orchestrated coups and propped up dictatorships, all to keep profits high. To understand the true cost of this fruit, we must peel back the marketing and confront the legacy of the so-called banana republics. That cheap banana in your cart is the end result of a century of violence and exploitation. Vast lands were seized, local farmers dispossessed, and workers forced into grueling, hazardous labor for meager pay. U.S. corporations with government backing crushed any resistance, labeling reform as communism and toppling leaders who dared to challenge them. The poverty, violence, and migration crises in Central America today are direct consequences of this history. Every banana is a reminder of the human cost hidden behind its low price. At the heart of this saga is the United Fruit Company, a corporation that became more powerful than the countries it operated in. United Fruit controlled land, transport, and communication, using bribery and force to dominate entire nations. Workers who demanded rights faced military crackdowns, as in the infamous Banana Massacre. The term Banana Republic was born from this reality. Countries run for the profit of a foreign fruit company. The American public saw only the fruit, never the empire behind it. United Fruit was born from the merger of two ambitious American enterprises, combining land, logistics, and ruthless ambition. Their model: total control, owning the plantations, the railroads, the ports, and the ships. Central America became a corporate playground, its resources extracted and its people left impoverished. In the U.S., United Fruit sold itself as a force for progress. In reality, it was an engine of exploitation. The company's rise marked the dawn of a new kind of empire, one ruled by profit, not by flag. In Guatemala and Honduras, United Fruit blurred the line between corporation and government. It became the largest landowner, employer, and exporter, writing its own laws and handpicking leaders. American managers lived in luxury, while local workers endured poverty and repression. When local leaders resisted, United Fruit used mercenaries and coups to maintain control, with barely a protest from the U.S. government. This was corporate power at its most extreme. When laws became inconvenient, the company simply overthrew the nation itself. The railroad was the Trojan horse of the United Fruit Company. On the surface, it was presented as a gift of progress and modernity, a vital piece of infrastructure that would connect isolated interiors to the global economy. Central American governments, desperate for development and lacking the capital to build these massive projects themselves, were lured in by the promise of steel tracks and steam engines. UFC and its predecessors would offer to build these national railways, seemingly at their own expense. But the price they extracted in return was astronomical. A devil's bargain that would cost these nations their economic independence for the next century. The railroad was never meant to serve the country, it was designed to serve the company. The deals were masterpieces of corporate extortion. In exchange for laying down track, the company demanded land, immense quantities of it. For every mile of railroad built, the company would be granted thousands of acres of the most fertile land adjacent to the tracks. In Guatemala, the government handed over vast territories of public land and even coerced indigenous communities to give up their ancestral holdings. The ruse was that this land was needed to support the railroad's construction and operation. The reality was that this land was the true prize. The company now possessed a perfect, vertically integrated system, a free transportation network running directly through free land, which it would then use to grow the bananas that the railroad would carry to its own private ports. Furthermore, these railroads were not designed to connect the people or cities of Central America. They were not built to create a national transportation grid that would foster internal trade and unity. Instead, they were constructed for a single purpose: to link the company's inland banana plantations directly to the coastal ports that it also controlled. The tracks ran from the groves to the sea, and nowhere else that mattered. This strategic layout deliberately fragmented the national economy, ensuring that the only significant commercial activity flowed through United Fruit's hands. Any local farmer or producer who wanted to get their goods to market had to use the company's railroad and pay its exorbitant fees, reinforcing UFC's monopoly and strangling any potential competition before it could even start. This railroad monopoly gave United Fruit life or death power over the entire region. The company controlled the arteries of commerce. It could dictate shipping rates, prioritize its own cargo, and leave the produce of local farmers to rot on the loading docks if they didn't comply with its demands. The infrastructure that was sold as a key to national prosperity became the very instrument of its economic subjugation. The steel rails that cut through the jungle were not pathways to a brighter future. They were shackles, binding the economies of Central America to the will of a single American corporation and ensuring that the wealth of the land would flow in only one direction, north. By the 1920s, the United Fruit Company was so deeply embedded in the economic and political life of Central America that it earned a new nickname, Spanish for the Octopus. The moniker was terrifyingly accurate. The company's tentacles reached into every corner of society, wrapping themselves around governments, strangling local economies, and squeezing the life out of any form of dissent or competition. Its power was not just economic, it was structural, a pervasive force that dictated the terms of daily existence for millions of people. It did not just do business in Central America, it owned Central America, and its grip was suffocating. Its profits soared, reaching over $200 million per year in 1920s dollars, a fortune built on the systematic impoverishment of an entire region. One of the longest tentacles of the octopus was its control over labor. The company was the region's largest employer, a fact it used as leverage to suppress wages to near-starvation levels. Workers on the banana plantations toiled for 12 hours a day in blistering heat, performing back-breaking labor for pennies. They were often paid not in cash, but in company scrip, vouchers that could only be redeemed at the company-owned stores known as commissaries. At these stores, basic goods were sold at inflated prices, ensuring that whatever meager wages the workers earned flowed right back to the company. This system of debt peonage trapped families for generations, creating a permanent, dependent workforce with no hope of social or economic mobility. Another tentacle was the manipulation of trade and finance. United Fruit controlled the national ports through its subsidiary, the International Railways of Central America, and its Great White Fleet. This gave it a stranglehold on all imports and exports. It could charge rivals prohibitive fees, bankrupting them or forcing them into buyouts. It also functioned as an unofficial central bank, its financial stability far greater than that of the host governments. The company's influence was so profound that it could trigger currency devaluations or credit crises simply by shifting its assets. This financial power kept national governments weak, dependent, and perpetually in debt to American banks that often worked in concert with UFC. The final and perhaps most insidious tentacle was its control over politics and information. The company's lobbyists, lawyers, and executives were more powerful than ambassadors. They had direct lines to the US State Department, and later, the CIA. In Washington, they painted a picture of benevolent investment, while on the ground, they propped up brutal dictators who would protect their interests. Men like Guatemala's Jorge Ubico and Honduras's Tiburcio Carrillas Andino ruled with an iron fist for decades, thanks to the financial and political support of United Fruit. They outlawed unions, crushed peasant uprisings, and silenced journalists who dared to criticize. The octopus had not only captured the economy, it had captured the state itself, ensuring that its empire would remain unchallenged for generations. By the middle of the 20th century, United Fruit's empire was, well, pretty much absolute. But a new threat was starting to show up. And it wasn't from some rival corporation. Nope, it was from the ballot box. In 1944, the people of Guatemala actually rose up and overthrew the brutal dictator Jorge Ubico, who just happened to be a longtime buddy of United Fruit. This so-called October Revolution kicked off a whole decade of unprecedented democracy and social reform. For the first time, Guatemala had a government that, honestly, seemed more interested in serving its citizens than, say, a Boston-based fruit company. This democratic spring reached its peak with the 1951 election of Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, a former army colonel who promised to modernize his country and turn it from a semi-colonial dependency into a truly independent capitalist state. And get this, his vision wasn't inspired by Moscow, but by Roosevelt's New Deal. Arbenz's main policy was Decree 900, a pretty modest land reform law designed to break up Guatemala's feudal agricultural system. The law was straightforward. It would let the government expropriate and redistribute large, uncultivated tracts of land to landless peasants. It only targeted fallow land, and the owners would be compensated based on the value they themselves had declared on their tax forms. This, folks, was a direct threat too. United Fruit was Guatemala's biggest landowner, but it actually cultivated just a small fraction of its holdings, keeping the rest idle to prevent competition and, well, keep its monopoly nice and safe. Under Decree 900, hundreds of thousands of acres of this unused United Fruit land were now up for expropriation. The company that had basically written Guatemala's laws for 50 years was suddenly being told to actually follow them. United Fruit's response? It wasn't to negotiate or comply. Instead, the company decided to manufacture a crisis. And honestly, they had some pretty powerful friends in high places. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother CIA Director Alan Dulles had both worked for Sullivan and Cromwell, the law firm that represented United Fruit. These guys saw the world through the same lens. What was good for United Fruit was good for America. The company, led by its master publicist Edward Bernays, the so-called father of propaganda, launched a massive PR campaign. The goal was to reframe Árbenz's moderate capitalist land reform as a hostile, Soviet-backed communist takeover. It was a calculated, cynical, and, let's be honest, devastatingly effective lie. They painted Árbenz as a Kremlin puppet, a dangerous radical opening a Soviet beachhead in America's backyard. Newspapers across the United States fed a steady diet of United Fruit Company press releases and, yeah, totally fabricated stories, started printing sensational headlines about the Red Threat in Guatemala. They ignored the fact that Guatemala's Communist Party was tiny, just 4 members in Congress, and had no real role in the government. They also ignored that Árbenz's policies were way less radical than land reforms the US actually supported in countries like Japan and South Korea. But, the truth didn't really matter. The narrative was set. Árbenz wasn't a reformer, he was a communist. And in the feverish climate of the Cold War, that label was basically a death sentence. So, with the political stage set and the communist threat locked into the minds of Washington's elite, the CIA got the green light. The mission, codenamed Operation PBS Success, was a covert plot to overthrow the democratically elected government of Jacobo Árbenz. And wow, it would become the agency's masterpiece, a terrifyingly efficient blueprint for regime change that, honestly, would be copied around the world for decades. But let's be real, this operation wasn't about protecting American security or stopping communism. It was about protecting the assets and profits of the United Fruit Company. This was foreign policy, basically outsourced to a corporation, a private conflict settled with public clandestine force. The whole thing cost about $3 million, which was peanuts compared to the value of United Fruit's holdings. The plan? Oh, it was multifaceted. A textbook case of psychological warfare and covert action. The CIA picked a disgruntled Guatemalan exile, Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, to be the face of the so-called liberation. They armed, trained, and funded a small mercenary army for him in neighboring Honduras and Nicaragua, both ruled by dictators who were, conveniently, friendly to the US and United Fruit. But here's the thing, this army was mostly for show. The real invasion wasn't about soldiers, it was about fear. The core of PBS Success was a campaign of psychological terror, designed to convince the Guatemalan people, and way more importantly, the Guatemalan military, that a massive popular uprising was underway, and that resistance was totally futile. It was a war of perception, fought with radio waves and rumors. The CIA set up a secret radio station called the Voice of Liberation, broadcasting from just over the border. Day and night it pumped out a relentless stream of disinformation. Fake news about major battles and uprisings, announcements about the supposed defections of high-ranking military officers, and threatening messages warning that anyone who supported Árbenz would face harsh retribution. The goal? Create an atmosphere of chaos, panic, and paranoia. To really crank up the pressure, the CIA used a small fleet of unmarked planes flown by American pilots to drop propaganda leaflets and, crucially, to carry out small-scale bombing runs on Guatemala City. The bombs were small, but the psychological impact absolutely enormous. This was a phantom invasion. Castillo Armas's mercenary force barely crossed the border and only got into minor skirmishes. The real battle was for the mind. The constant radio broadcasts and the sight of American planes bombing the capital convinced the Guatemalan Army's officer corps that they were facing an overwhelming US-backed force. They believed they were isolated, and that a full-scale American invasion was just around the corner if they didn't act. They feared for their own survival, and started to see their commander-in-chief Árbenz as a liability, someone leading them into a disastrous war they couldn't possibly win. The CIA's script was working perfectly. The seeds of betrayal had been planted, and now they were about to bear fruit. While the CIA was busy orchestrating the covert war on the ground, United Fruit was masterminding the public relations war back in the United States. This was a crucial second front, absolutely essential for keeping political support strong and making sure the American public stayed either supportive or, blissfully ignorant of the coup. The company's chief propagandist, Edward Bernays, a nephew of Sigmund Freud by the way, was a true pioneer in the art of manipulating public opinion. He understood that you could sell a war just like you could sell a product. For Bernays, overthrowing Árbenz was the ultimate marketing challenge, and he tackled it with methodical brilliance, turning a corporate dispute into a patriotic crusade against global communism. Bernays set up a whole series of seemingly independent events to create an echo chamber of anti-Árbenz sentiment. He arranged for influential American journalists and publishers to take these carefully curated fact-finding trips to Guatemala. There they were wined and dined by company officials and introduced to hand-picked members of the opposition, who of course fed them stories of communist atrocities and Soviet influence. These journalists went back to the United States and wrote glowing articles praising United Fruit's so-called civilizing mission and damning Árbenz's totalitarian regime. Prestigious publications like the New York Times, Time, and Life magazine all ran stories that matched the United Fruit and CIA narrative, giving it an air of objective credibility. The American public had no reason to doubt what they were reading. The company also funded the creation of fake grassroots organizations and academic studies. They set up a front group called the Middle American Information Bureau, which flooded newsrooms and congressional offices with press releases and research papers about the supposed communist infiltration of Guatemala. They even hired academics to produce reports that gave their claims a nice scholarly sheen. This constant barrage of information, all pointing to the same conclusion, created an overwhelming consensus. Anyone who questioned the narrative was dismissed as a communist sympathizer or, dangerously naive. The lie became so pervasive that it was accepted as fact, even at the highest levels of government. This masterful propaganda campaign made sure that when the coup began, there was zero political opposition in Washington. The Eisenhower administration could act with total confidence, knowing that Congress and the public believed they were defending the hemisphere from Soviet aggression. The real motive, protecting the profits of a single company, was buried under layers of patriotic rhetoric and Cold War fear-mongering. United Fruit and the CIA hadn't just manufactured a crisis in Guatemala, they'd manufactured the consent for its violent resolution back home. The war for hearts and minds was won long before the first bomb was ever dropped on Guatemala City. On June 18, 1954, the final act began. Castillo Armas's tiny force of just a few hundred mercenaries crossed the border from Honduras into Guatemala. Honestly, it was less an invasion and more of a staged media event. At the same time, the CIA's psychological warfare campaign reached its absolute peak. The so-called Voice of Liberation radio station started blasting frantic reports, claiming Armas's army was sweeping across the country, backed by massive popular uprisings. CIA planes painted to look like rebel aircraft buzzed the capital, dropping leaflets that demanded Árbenz's resignation. They even carried out sporadic bombing runs, targeting ammunition depots and oil tanks, just to create dramatic explosions and spread terror among the civilians. The air was literally thick with lies and smoke. President Árbenz found himself completely trapped. He knew the invading force was small and weak, but when he tried to rally his own military, his officers were paralyzed by fear and indecision. They'd been so thoroughly demoralized by the CIA's propaganda that they genuinely believed they were up against the full might of the United States. They flat-out refused Árbenz's orders to arm civilian militias and peasant groups who were actually eager to defend the government, because apparently they feared an armed populace more than the so-called invasion. Meanwhile, the American ambassador John Purifoy, one of the main architects of the whole plot, delivered the final blows. He handed the military leadership lists of officers who would be labeled communists and targeted if Árbenz stayed in power. The psychological pressure worked exactly as planned. The army chief saw the writing on the wall and confronted Árbenz, telling him that if he didn't resign, they'd stop fighting for him and cut a deal with Castillo Armas instead. Isolated, betrayed by his own military, and desperate to avoid a civil war he now believed would trigger a direct US invasion, Jacobo Arbenz had no choice. On June 27, just 9 days after the so-called invasion started, he went on national radio and delivered a heartbreaking farewell speech, announcing his resignation. He condemned the brutal and inhuman forces of the United Fruit Company and the American government, but by then, it was just too late. Guatemala's decade of democracy was over. With Arbenz gone, Castillo Armas was flown into Guatemala City on an American embassy plane and installed as the new dictator. His first acts? He immediately repealed Decree 900, handing all the expropriated land right back to the United Fruit Company. He outlawed political parties, burned subversive books, and rounded up and executed thousands of students, labor leaders, and political opponents. Democracy wasn't just defeated, it was systematically dismantled and erased. The coup was a resounding success for its architects. United Fruit got its land back, along with a brand new obedient government. The CIA got another feather in its cap. And the people of Guatemala, well, they were plunged into 4 decades of brutal civil war that would ultimately claim the lives of over 200,000 people. The 1954 Guatemalan coup was not some isolated incident. It was actually the culmination of half a century of American military intervention in Central America and the Caribbean, a period that's often called the Banana Wars. Now, while PBS success was unique for its slick use of psychological warfare, the basic principle was always the same: use US power to protect US corporate interests. This wasn't really foreign policy, it was more like a business practice. From the early 1900s onward, whenever a country in the region dared to challenge the dominance of American companies, especially United Fruit, the US Marines were never far behind. The pattern was depressingly consistent, setting up a clear doctrine of economic imperialism enforced by military might. Take Honduras, for example, maybe the original Banana Republic. Between 1903 and 1925, the US military intervened there at least 7 times. These weren't massive wars, but quick, decisive occupations to protect American lives and property, which, let's be honest, was just code for protecting United Fruit's plantations and railroads during political turmoil or labor unrest. If a government fell out of favor with UFC, or if strikes threatened the banana harvest, US warships would show up and Marines would land to restore order. And that order always looked the same: a new pro-UFC government in charge and striking workers crushed, often violently. The story was pretty similar in Nicaragua. The US Marines occupied that country almost non-stop from 1912 to 1933. The first intervention was all about propping up a conservative, pro-US government that handed out lucrative concessions to American corporations. When Augusto Sandino, a nationalist hero, led a rebellion against the US occupation and their puppet government, the Marines waged a long and brutal counterinsurgency campaign. When the US finally left, they handed over power to a well-armed National Guard, trained and equipped by Americans, under the ruthless Anastasio Somoza Garcia. Somoza promptly assassinated Sandino, seized power, and set up a family dynasty that ruled Nicaragua for over 40 years, always with Washington's backing, and to the great benefit of American companies. This doctrine left a legacy of dependency and authoritarianism. By always siding with dictators and oligarchs against popular democratic movements, the United States actively stunted the political development of Central America. It taught the region's elites that their power depended not on their own people, but on approval from Washington and its corporate buddies. And it taught the people that democracy was a fragile gift, one that could be snatched away at any moment if it threatened American profits. The CIA's coup in Guatemala was really just the Cold War evolution of this long-standing practice, swapping out Marines for spies but keeping the same goal: making sure Central America stayed a reliable, profitable backyard for the United States. For the thousands of men who toiled on the vast plantations of the United Fruit Company, life was just a relentless cycle of grueling labor and systemic exploitation. The company's massive profits were built directly on their backs, squeezed out through a system designed to keep them poor, powerless, and always dependent. The workday started before dawn and ended long after dusk, a brutal routine of cutting and hauling heavy banana stalks in suffocating tropical heat. The physical toll was enormous, leading to chronic injuries, exhaustion, and a much shorter life expectancy. Yet for all that backbreaking work, the laborers got wages that were barely enough to survive, often just a few cents an hour. And let's be clear, this wasn't just market forces at work. It was a deliberate strategy to maximize profit by minimizing the humanity of the workforce. The company had perfected a system of control that went way beyond the fields. Workers were often paid not in real money but in company-issued scrip or vouchers. This private currency was worthless outside the plantation, only redeemable at the company's own stores, the so-called. And in those stores, basic necessities like rice, beans, and tools were sold at outrageously inflated prices, making sure that a worker's meager earnings flowed right back into the company's pockets. This created a vicious cycle of debt peonage, trapping workers and their families in a state of permanent servitude. To leave the plantation meant giving up your earnings and facing destitution, basically turning company towns into open-air prisons that were nearly impossible to escape. Any attempt by workers to organize for better conditions was met with swift and brutal repression. Union formation was strictly forbidden, and labor leaders were systematically targeted, fired, blacklisted, or worse. The company had its own private army of overseers and security guards, often called the White Guard, to enforce discipline and crush any hint of dissent. This internal police force worked hand in glove with national militaries and local police, who were basically on the company payroll. A worker who dared to speak out about low wages or unsafe conditions wasn't just risking his job, he was risking his life. The message was loud and clear. The company's authority was absolute, and any challenge would be crushed without mercy. This brutal labor regime was justified by a deeply racist ideology that viewed Central American and Caribbean workers, a mix of indigenous people, mestizos, and imported Afro-Caribbean laborers, as inherently inferior. Company managers and American supervisors routinely used derogatory terms, seeing the workers as lazy, unintelligent, and childlike, supposedly in need of the firm hand of their American bosses. This dehumanization made the systemic exploitation palatable to those who enforced it, and to the shareholders back in the United States. It allowed the company to treat its workers not as human beings with rights and aspirations, but as just another input in the production process, a disposable resource to be used up and discarded in the relentless pursuit of cheap bananas. The most infamous and honestly horrifying example of United Fruit's war on labor didn't actually happen in Central America, but right next door in Colombia, back in 1928. It's a chilling reminder of just how far the company would go to protect its profits and the deadly alliance it had built with local governments. In the coastal region around Ciénaga, thousands of United Fruit workers went on strike. Their demands? Shockingly modest by today's standards. They wanted written contracts, an 8-hour workday, a 6-day work week, and to get rid of the scrip system so they could actually be paid in real money. They weren't asking for a revolution, just basic human dignity and for Colombia's own labor laws to be enforced. But United Fruit flat out refused to negotiate. Instead, the company branded the strike as some kind of subversive, communist-inspired uprising that supposedly threatened national stability. Company officials were frantically sending cables to the U.S. Embassy, warning that American lives and property were at risk and basically demanding intervention. They leaned hard on the Colombian government in Bogotá, hinting that if the strike wasn't crushed, the United States might just send in the Marines to protect corporate interests. That veiled threat worked like a charm. The conservative Colombian government, terrified of a U.S. invasion and eager to prove its loyalty to its powerful business partner, declared a state of siege and sent the National Army into the Banana Zone. On the night of December 6, 1928, several thousand striking workers and their families gathered peacefully in the central plaza of Ciénaga, just waiting to hear from the provincial governor and hoping for some kind of peaceful solution. Instead, sometime after midnight, troops under General Cortés Vargas surrounded the plaza. After a 5-minute warning to disperse, one that probably wasn't even heard or understood by the packed crowd, the soldiers opened fire with machine guns. The army shot indiscriminately into the crowd of unarmed men, women, and children. The shooting was relentless, turning the town square into a literal killing field. The night air was filled with screams, chaos, and the stench of gunpowder and blood. The exact number of dead is still debated, since the military quickly removed the bodies, reportedly dumping them into the Caribbean Sea from trains in the dead of night. The official government report claimed only 9 people died, which is just absurd. The U.S. ambassador's report to Washington mentioned a much higher number, and survivor accounts and historians estimate anywhere from 400 to over 2,000 people were killed. This event, later immortalized by Gabriel Garcia Marquez in his novel, became known as the Banana Massacre. It sent a clear and terrifying message to workers all across the United Fruit Empire. the price for demanding your rights was death. The human cost of the banana empire wasn't just about violence or economic exploitation, it also involved a slow, creeping poisoning of both people and the land itself. In the pursuit of that perfect, unblemished yellow banana that American shoppers expected, United Fruit waged a chemical war on the environment. These massive monoculture plantations, acres and acres of just one plant species, were ecological disasters waiting to happen. They were extremely vulnerable to pests and fungal diseases, especially the notorious Panama disease, which could wipe out entire plantations. The company's answer wasn't more biodiversity, but instead, a massive and pretty reckless use of toxic chemicals. Starting in the mid-20th century, crop-dusting planes became a regular sight, swooping low over banana groves and workers' barracks alike, coating everything in a chemical fog. One of the worst offenders was DDT, a powerful insecticide that was later banned in the US because of its devastating impact on the environment and human health. But on the banana plantations, it was used without hesitation. Workers were sent into freshly sprayed fields with no protective gear, their skin and lungs exposed to the toxic mist. The chemicals seeped into the soil, contaminating the food crops families grew in their gardens, and poisoning the rivers and streams that were their only sources for drinking and bathing. Another especially toxic chemical was a nematicide called dibromochloropropane, or DBCP. This stuff was used to kill tiny worms that attacked banana roots. By the 1970s, the American manufacturer of DBCP had figured out that it caused sterility in male factory workers and was a suspected carcinogen. The US banned it, but the chemical companies, seeing an opportunity, shipped tons of it to Central America, where United Fruit, by then calling itself Chiquita, and others kept using it for years. These companies knew the risks, but exposed their workers anyway. This chemical assault was a kind of slow-motion violence. The effects weren't as immediate as a bullet, but just as deadly. The contamination of the ecosystem was deep and long-lasting. The soil became saturated with toxins, killing off beneficial insects, microorganisms, and other plant life, leaving behind a sterile and dependent landscape. Rivers that once teemed with fish became toxic, carrying poison downstream to coastal and mangrove ecosystems. The company's obsession with a perfect-looking fruit led them to sacrifice the long-term health of the land and the people, creating a poisoned legacy that still felt generations later. The chemical warfare waged on the plantations left deep and permanent scars on the bodies of the workers and their families. Constant exposure to a mix of toxic pesticides like DDT and DBCP created a public health disaster that played out over decades. For the men working directly in the fields, the immediate effects were things like skin rashes, breathing problems, and neurological damage. But the most devastating impact was on their ability to have children. Thousands of male banana workers exposed to DBCP found themselves sterile, robbed of the chance to start families. This silent epidemic left behind a generation of broken men and childless families, a tragedy that rippled through entire communities. Women and children suffered just as much. Women who washed their husbands' pesticide-soaked work clothes or who drank and bathed in contaminated water experienced high rates of miscarriages, stillbirths, and uterine cancer. The children who were born often carried the burden of their parents' exposure. In places like Costa Rica and Nicaragua, doctors started seeing alarming cancer clusters and a spike in children born with severe birth defects, congenital deformities, developmental disabilities, and rare childhood cancers. The poison sprayed on the bananas had entered the very DNA of these communities, inflicting a multi-generational punishment. The fruit company's response? It was a masterclass in denial and deflection. For decades, they denied any link between the chemicals and the health problems plaguing their workers. They suppressed internal studies, refused to provide protective gear, and fought tooth and nail in court against thousands of lawsuits from sick and sterile workers. They used their massive legal and financial power to drag out cases for years, bankrupting plaintiffs and, frankly, waiting for them to die. While they eventually paid out some small settlements, they never fully admitted guilt or took real responsibility for the lives they'd destroyed. To them, the cost of a human life was just another business expense to minimize. The legacy of this chemical exposure is a community's health held hostage. Even now, the soil and water in many former plantation regions remain contaminated. Cancer rates and chronic illnesses are still way higher than average. The generations of children who were never born because of mass sterility mark a demographic scar, an erasure of entire family lines. This was the hidden cost of cheap bananas. While American consumers enjoyed their perfect, affordable fruit, the real price was paid by Central American families, in their bodies, their children, and their future. The bright yellow banana peel hides a much darker story, one written in medical reports and etched onto the bodies of its victims. The United Fruit Company did not just exploit people, it waged war on nature itself. The business model was predicated on creating vast, unnatural landscapes known as monocultures, endless fields of a single crop. To achieve this, entire ecosystems had to be erased. The company clear-cut hundreds of thousands of acres of vibrant, biodiverse tropical rainforest, one of the most complex and vital ecosystems on the planet. The majestic ceiba trees, the dense jungle canopy that was home to countless species of birds, monkeys, and insects, were all felled and burned to make way for the orderly, sterile rows of banana plants. This was not farming, it was the creation of a green desert. This widespread deforestation had catastrophic environmental consequences. The rainforests of Central America play a critical role in regulating local climate, creating rainfall, and stabilizing the soil. With the trees gone, the delicate topsoil, rich with centuries of organic matter, was left exposed to the elements. The intense tropical rains, no longer absorbed by the forest canopy and root systems, washed the fertile soil away, a process known as soil erosion. This silt ran into the rivers, choking them with sediment, killing aquatic life, and making them prone to flash floods that would devastate the surrounding areas. The land became progressively less fertile, requiring even more chemical fertilizers to remain productive, locking the company into a vicious cycle of ecological degradation. The monoculture itself was an ecological time bomb. In a natural forest, a diversity of plant and animal species creates a resilient system where pests and diseases are kept in check by natural predators and biological complexity. In a monoculture, this resilience is gone. A single pest or fungus can spread like wildfire with nothing to stop it. This is precisely what happened with the Gros Michel banana, the primary variety grown by United Fruit Company for the first half of the 20th century. The arrival of Panama disease, a soil-borne fungus, utterly devastated the plantations. The company's response was not to diversify but to simply abandon the infected lands, leaving behind an ecological wasteland, and clear-cut new sections of rainforest to start again, repeating the destructive cycle. This slash-and-burn approach to agriculture treated the land as a disposable commodity rather than a finite resource. The company's legacy is not just one of political and social turmoil, but of profound environmental scarring. They left behind a landscape fundamentally altered for the worse, depleted soils, polluted rivers, and a drastic loss of biodiversity. The natural wealth of Central America, its vibrant forests and fertile earth, was plundered to create a short-term profit for a foreign corporation. The ecological balance of an entire region was sacrificed for the sake of a single fruit, creating an unnatural kingdom from which the land and its people have yet to recover. The United Fruit Company may have changed its name and sold off its direct land holdings in the 1970s, but the institutions it shattered were never rebuilt. The legacy of its century of dominance is not a historical footnote. It is the very architecture of the chaos that defines much of Central America today. The 1954 CIA coup in Guatemala did not just oust a single president, it murdered a nation's democratic aspirations in their infancy. The decades of brutal civil war that followed, fought between the US-backed military dictatorships and leftist guerrilla groups, were a direct consequence of this intervention. This conflict systematically eliminated a generation of moderate political leaders, academics, student activists, and union organizers, leaving a power vacuum filled only by extremists and criminals. The political center was not just defeated, it was exterminated. This deliberate destruction of civil society created the perfect breeding ground for organized crime. When the civil wars formally ended in the 1990s, the state was a hollowed-out shell, crippled by corruption and deeply distrusted by its own citizens. The military and police forces, long trained by the US to operate as instruments of terror rather than public servants, were easily co-opted by emerging drug cartels. The same trafficking routes once used for smuggling weapons during the Cold War became conduits for cocaine heading north. The gangs that now terrorize communities in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, like MS-13 and Barrio 18, have their origins in the social dislocation of these wars and were incubated in the prisons of Los Angeles before being deported back to these broken states, which had no capacity to absorb them. The endemic violence that plagues the region is not a random cultural pathology, it is the ghost of the Banana Republic. The institutions that could have provided a bulwark against this chaos, a functioning judiciary, a professional police force, a trusted government, a vibrant civil society, were precisely the institutions that United Fruit and the US government spent 50 years systematically dismantling because they threatened corporate profits. The company created a culture of impunity where the powerful were above the law, a lesson that the new oligarchs and cartel leaders learned very well. The violence is a symptom of a much deeper disease, the absence of a legitimate state, a void created intentionally for the benefit of a fruit company. Therefore, to look at the headlines about gang violence and government corruption in the Northern Triangle today and not see the shadow of El Pulpo is to be willfully blind. The cycle of violence is the direct, predictable, and tragic inheritance of a foreign policy that prioritized bananas over democracy. The United States did not simply intervene and leave, it performed a radical surgery on the body politic of these nations, removing the vital organs of self-governance and leaving behind a festering wound. The cartels and gangs are merely the infection that grew in that wound, a brutal reminder that the history of corporate greed is written in the blood of today's victims. Look at the images of desperate families arriving at the US southern border, and you are looking at the end result of a century of agricultural theft. The modern migration crisis is not a new phenomenon. It is the delayed invoice for the systematic dispossession of Central American farmers. Before the arrival of United Fruit, the region was home to a thriving system of subsistence agriculture and local markets. Peasants and indigenous communities owned and farmed communal lands, growing a diverse range of crops that sustained their families and local economies. This system was not perfect, but it provided a foundation of self-sufficiency and a deep connection to the land that had been cultivated for generations. This was the world that United Fruit deliberately destroyed. The company's insatiable appetite for land, acquired through corrupt government concessions and outright force, pushed millions of people off their ancestral farms. This created a massive class of landless poor, people who had lost not only their property, but their entire way of life. Their only option for survival was to become low-wage laborers on the very plantations that now occupied their stolen land. This transformation from independent farmer to dependent wage slave was the first great internal displacement. It severed the connection between people and the soil, replacing food security with precarious, poverty-level employment that was subject to the whims of a foreign corporation and the volatility of the global commodities market. The ecological devastation left behind by the banana companies compounded the crisis. The clear-cutting of rainforests led to soil erosion and desertification, making the land less productive for those who remained. The heavy use of toxic pesticides contaminated the water tables and rendered vast areas unsafe for farming or living. When the companies abandoned these poisoned lands for fresher territory, they left behind an environmental catastrophe. This legacy of ecological ruin means that even today, small farmers struggle to grow crops in depleted soil, face unpredictable weather patterns caused by deforestation, and contend with a landscape that can no longer sustain them, forcing their children and grandchildren to look for opportunities elsewhere. This is why they come. The mass migration from countries like Honduras, where an astonishing 70% of the population lives in poverty, is not a choice, but a necessity. It is a direct consequence of a historical process that stripped people of their land, destroyed their local economies, and degraded their environment, all for the sake of cheap fruit. The journey north is a desperate search for the economic security that was stolen from them in their own homes. When American politicians ask why people are leaving Central America, they are asking a question their own country answered a century ago. They are leaving because the foundations of their societies were systematically bulldozed to make way for a banana plantation. The United Fruit Company officially ceased to exist in 1970, rebranding itself as Chiquita Brands International to escape its blood-soaked reputation. But, a change of name does not erase an institutional culture of criminality. The Octopus simply learned to hide its tentacles more effectively. The proof came in 2007, a moment that should have shocked the world but was largely buried in the business pages. Chiquita Brands pleaded guilty in a U.S. federal court to the charge of engaging in transactions with a specially designated global terrorist. The company admitted to paying approximately $1.7 million over several years to the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or AUC, which was one of the most brutal paramilitary death squads in the Western Hemisphere. The AUC was a designated terrorist organization responsible for massacres, torture, political assassinations, and drug trafficking. Chiquita claimed these were protection payments, just a cost of doing business in a violent region. But court documents and testimonies from former paramilitary leaders revealed a much deeper, more sinister partnership. Chiquita's payments were not just extortion, they were a strategic investment. The company used the AUC as a private army to terrorize its workforce into submission, assassinate labor organizers, and secure its operations in Colombia's banana-growing regions. In exchange for cash, and according to some allegations, shipments of weapons smuggled in on company boats, the AUC ensured that Chiquita's plantations remained union-free and profitable. It was the Banana Massacre of 1928, updated for the 21st century with plausible deniability. For this confessed crime of funding a terrorist death squad, Chiquita was fined a mere $25 million by the U.S. Department of Justice. To a multi-billion-dollar corporation, this was not a punishment. It was basically a parking ticket. No executives went to jail. The company continued to operate, its bananas still stocking the shelves of supermarkets worldwide. The message sent was chillingly clear. Corporate sponsorship of terrorism is a manageable business expense. The case demonstrated that the fundamental DNA of the old United Fruit Company was alive and well, willing to partner with the most violent actors imaginable to protect its bottom line, confident that the consequences would be financially insignificant. This modern chapter reveals the lie that the era of the banana republics is over. The tactics have evolved from overt coups to covert payments, from U.S. Marines to paramilitary proxies, but the underlying philosophy remains the same. The pursuit of profit still justifies alliances with killers. The lives of Central and South American workers are still considered expendable. And corporations, now more global and powerful than ever, can still commit heinous crimes with near total impunity, protected by armies of lawyers and a justice system that values corporate stability over human life. The octopus never died. It just rebranded and learned to navigate the modern legal system more effectively. The story of how the United States stole Central America for a fruit company is not a comfortable one. It is a history that challenges the narrative of America as a benevolent superpower and a champion of democracy. And, honestly, it's for this reason that it has been so effectively erased from our collective memory, absent from our history textbooks and political discourse. We have chosen to forget because remembering carries a heavy price, the price of acknowledgement, of responsibility, of debt. The problems of Central America, the violence, the poverty, the migration, are presented as homegrown failures, a tragic but distant reality for which we bear no blame. This is the final and most successful lie of the banana empire. This national amnesia allows the cycle to continue. U.S. foreign policy toward the region is still largely shaped by corporate interests and a tough-on crime security-first approach that completely ignores the root causes of instability. We send millions in security aid to the very same corrupt military and police forces that oppress their own people. We impose trade deals that benefit American corporations at the expense of small farmers, perpetuating the cycle of economic dependency. We treat the migrants fleeing the consequences of our own historical actions as an invading threat to be repelled, rather than as refugees from a crisis we helped create. Our ignorance is not benign, it is an active policy choice that perpetuates the suffering. To break this cycle requires a radical act of remembering. It requires that we, as consumers and citizens, confront the uncomfortable truth that our comfort has been subsidized by others' pain. The low price of a banana is not a miracle of the free market, it is a historical artifact of empire. Acknowledging this does not mean wallowing in guilt, but rather accepting a responsibility to change the present. It means demanding a foreign policy that prioritizes human rights and sustainable development over corporate profits. It means supporting fair trade practices that empower farmers instead of exploiting them. It means recognizing the asylum seekers at our border not as criminals, but as the human consequence of our own nation's history. Until we pay this debt of memory, we are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. The ghost of United Fruit will continue to haunt the hemisphere, and the blood of Central America will continue to silently stain the hands of American consumers. The legacy of the banana lie is a choice. We can continue to consume in ignorance, complicit in a system of exploitation, or we can educate ourselves and demand justice. We can accept that we are eating blood fruit, or we can finally begin the long and difficult work of cleansing the supply chain, one story, one policy, and one choice at a time. The first step is the hardest. We must admit that America didn't lose Central America, it gutted it for profit. We have journeyed through a century of violence, greed, and exploitation. We've unpeeled the cheerful yellow lie of the banana to find a core of darkness. The story is not one of abstract history or distant foreign policy, it is a story that ends in your kitchen, on your breakfast table. The uncomfortable truth is that the systems of power and extraction put in place by the United Fruit Company never truly disappeared. They evolved, they rebranded, and they continue to operate, ensuring that the fruit we consume remains cheap at an immense human cost. The convenience of our modern lives is inextricably and uncomfortably linked to the deliberate impoverishment and destabilization of our southern neighbors. This is the bitter fruit of a shared history we have chosen to ignore. Every purchase is a political act. While we may not consciously think about it, our consumer choices have power, and they reinforce existing supply chains. When we pick up a bunch of conventionally grown bananas, we are casting a vote for the status quo. We are sending a signal to the market that the current price, achieved through a legacy of suppressed wages, environmental destruction, and corporate impunity, is acceptable. We become the final, unwitting link in a chain that begins with a landless farmer and a polluted river. The blood, sweat, and tears shed in the banana groves of Central America are invisible ingredients, but they are present nonetheless. The system depends on our ignorance, on our collective decision not to ask where our food comes from and what it truly costs. This is not about individual guilt. You did not personally orchestrate a coup or poison a river, but we are all citizens of a nation that did, and we are all consumers in a market that was built on top of it. The burden is not to feel shame, but to accept a shared responsibility. The comfort of looking away, of treating the crises in Central America as their problem, is a luxury that history proves we cannot afford. The violence, poverty, and migration that we see today are not separate from us. They are the echoes of our own actions, the consequences of a history where American corporate profit was consistently valued more highly than Central American lives and sovereignty. The ghosts of the banana republics are at our border, asking for an asylum that our own history owes them. Confronting this truth is the first step. We must dismantle the comfortable fiction that separates our lives from theirs. The line between the supermarket aisle and the death squad, between the CIA memo and the migrant caravan, is direct and unbroken. The history of the United Fruit Company is not just a story about a corrupt corporation, it is a story about the foundations of the modern global economy. It reveals how power works, how narratives are constructed, and how the pursuit of profit can hollow out nations. To understand the banana is to understand the hidden mechanics of our world, a world built on a legacy of blood, soil, and a very convenient lie. So what can be done? It is easy to feel powerless in the face of such a vast and entrenched system. A simple consumer boycott, while well-intentioned, is often not enough to shift the behavior of multi-billion-dollar corporations. True change requires a more profound and multifaceted approach, a conscious effort to act as both an informed consumer and an engaged citizen. The first and most crucial step is education. We must commit to learning and sharing this hidden history, to ensuring that the story of United Fruit, of Fall of Árbenz, of the Banana Massacre is not forgotten. We must teach it in our schools and discuss it in our communities, transforming national amnesia into active, critical memory. Knowledge is the antidote to propaganda. As consumers, we can make deliberate choices. We can seek out and support brands that are certified by fair trade organizations. These certifications, while not perfect, are an attempt to create a more equitable system where farmers receive a fair price, workers are guaranteed basic rights and protections, and sustainable agricultural practices are encouraged. Choosing a fair trade banana might cost a few cents more, but that small premium is an investment in a different kind of world. It is a vote for dignity over exploitation. It is a signal to the market that we are willing to pay the true cost of our food, a price that includes the well-being of the people who produce it. Beyond our shopping carts, we must use our voices as citizens. We must demand a fundamental change in our nation's foreign policy toward Central America. This means lobbying our elected officials to end the failed strategies of the past. It means advocating for policies that support land reform, strengthen democratic institutions, and invest in sustainable, community-led development, rather than simply funding the same corrupt security forces. It means demanding that our government hold American corporations accountable for their abuses abroad, ensuring that a $25 million fine is no longer the acceptable price for funding terrorism. We must insist on a policy rooted in repair and respect, not domination and extraction. Ultimately, the story of the banana is a call to action. It asks us to look beyond the surface of things, to question the narratives we are sold, and to recognize our connection to people and places that may seem far away. The fight for justice in the banana fields is the same as the fight for a more just and sustainable world everywhere. It requires us to challenge the notion that profit is the only thing that matters, and to rebuild a system based on the radical idea that every person, whether in a Boston boardroom or a Honduran village, has a right to dignity, security, and a future free from violence. The cycle can be broken. The choice, as always, is ours.